I'm just gonna get started. Thanks for coming, everybody. My name's Keiko. I think I know most everyone here. Today I'm gonna talk partially about some of the research that I did for my dissertation, and then kind of leading into what I'll be working here on here at ESIIL about international conflicts. That's part one, and then food security will be part two, both in the same geographic region though. And first, I'll just give like a super brief about me for folks that don't know. I started getting into research doing like intertidal ecologies, like fieldwork in tide pools, and then also working doing experiments at the Marine Lab at SDSU. And then I had a little bit of a stint as an environmental educator doing like citizen science programs, running field trips, and being the head picture on Yelp for a nature science center for a little bit. So peeking. Then I went back to grad school at Oregon State University, where I got a master's in marine resource management, so super applied. I studied small-scale fisheries, adaptive capacity from like a data-driven perspective at the Socio-Environmental Analysis Lab. And then I stayed there to get my PhD in geography, which I just wrapped up this July. And I'll be sharing.
But you're not sharing your screen.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, thank you.
Well, the presentation looked too clean. We needed all the Zoom things.
Exactly. Yeah.
There we go. Okay.
Awesome.
Is it okay with the thing up?
You can like exit out. Yeah, there you go.
Yep. Okay. Cool. Well, nothing's really happened, so that's good. So yeah, and I'm going to share a bit about this PhD in geography dissertation, and then now I am here at ESIIL. Let's make this work on here now. There we go. Now I'm here at ESIIL with all of you guys. And I'm working on food security issues that I'll also share a bit today. And so most of my work, all of it has been ocean related, and it still is ocean related. And I know very well that I'm in Colorado right now. However,
it could be farther from the ocean.
I could be farther from the ocean. This is the most landlocked I've been though. So we got trout, we got fish, we got stuff. And really, I think if I were to break down sort of like core keywords of my research, it could fall into some of these categories. And I know a lot of people here think about these categories too, just in different systems, maybe wildfire, forestry, etc. So one reason I'm really excited to be here at ESIIL is to talk to people that think about these concepts in different fields and maybe see where there's gaps or areas to borrow ideas from each other. So if I'm talking today, if you see any of those opportunities, please let me know. I love just kind of chit-chatting in an interdisciplinary way like that. So enough about that. Today's presentation will be broken up into two components, but I'm going to try to smooth them out together into one sort of coherent narrative. And so this is one of my favorite chapters for my dissertation. It's also very empirical, so I feel like it a lot of data fits well with this. That's about assessing the risk of international conflict. And then, like I said, I'll try to bridge what I'm doing here at ESIIL, which is again looking at Pacific food systems where they both are located, but looking more at food security and nutrition aspects of fisheries. And the common narrative here is obviously oceans. I like to start with this mostly because it's pretty, really. But also it just showcases the diversity of habitats that oceans can have. And we all know that oceans also support several types of different ecosystem services, from jobs and food, energy, and more intangible things like cultural significance and intrinsic value, along with several types of sectors that reflect all of these services. And I'll be focusing on fisheries, which of course have their own contributions to these ecosystem services. When I say fisheries, it's kind of like agriculture or forestry. It's not just the fish in the ocean, it's the social, economic, political systems that are completely around that. So it's a social ecological system that can range from small scale, artisanal, local fisheries, all the way up to commercial, large scale, industrial ones. A lot of my work focuses on the industrial, the latter aspect of it, distant water fishing fleets, which go to foreign waters and areas beyond jurisdiction to fish. But altogether, they contribute a lot of jobs, not just the direct harvesting, but also the supply chains associated with seafood, contribute around 12% of people's protein worldwide. And then those more intangible, but also equally important services related to culture. And so these fisheries are changing a lot in recent decades. We think a lot about climate, but there's also a lot of socioeconomic and political changes here. This is from the FAO showing by region the number of shared fish stocks, the number of countries that are sharing multiple types of resources. So it's a lot, and a lot of them are in the Pacific, which is where I study as well. And here's a map showing fishing energy, fishing effort, the amount of time that countries are spending fishing in certain places. Those are all in the high seas. Those are not under any one country's jurisdiction or management. So it's very important that we think about these things. Here is the median distance from home port that countries are going away to fish. So it's further and further increasing. We're expanding our footprint. And that's not even to mention the supply chains that I'll talk about in the latter half. And alongside this, we have international agreements, transnational companies that really require a lot of coordination so that these interactions aren't unsustainable or lead to conflict. And in fact, conflict is what I think about. And so this is a super broad umbrella term that could just be disputes over marine resources. These can happen between fishers, fleets, countries, companies at all different scales. But I'm particularly thinking about international fisheries conflicts. And on this graph, over time, it shows the number of instances in media reports that international conflicts have been covered. You can see an overall rising trend. And some of you may have noticed some headlines like these down here at the bottom in the news highlighting these issues. One thing that I like to point out about this is that it's super diverse. These cover things like climate change or trade or Arctic geopolitics, distant water fishing fleets, all types of stuff. And so they're very broad and they can look a lot of different ways. People think about fisheries conflicts in terms of an intensity scale. So from 1 to 5, they can be relatively mild verbal disagreements between fishers at port, all the way up through economic, political, and diplomatic actions, and then maximizing in physical violence, and especially at the international level, military involvement can be quite common, which can lead to geopolitical conflict. So beyond just fisheries well-being and the sustainability of the fisheries, these fisheries conflicts in particular have the unique ability to scale up into international disputes. And what's really difficult about addressing these is that there's all kinds of drivers of these conflicts. They can be environmental or social, spatial, economic, even related to the governance itself. And there are hardly ever one at play. They're very interrelated. And so it's hard to get to the root of the problem. But for my research here, I try to like flip that around on its head. And maybe we can see this as an opportunity where we can use these as clues to study the likelihood or the risk of conflict occurring by tapping into these given factors. And so this, I guess, is kind of like my laundry list of wish list for data, but like that's so hard to do. So I'm focusing on 2 in particular: competition over space and the historical relationships between parties. And so spatial competition, you have 2 fishing vessels kind of sharing a parcel of the ocean. This is kind of a prerequisite for conflict. Sharing space can also imply things like targeting the same species, or maybe there's negative interactions between fishing vessel gear types. But regardless, we can think of this as sort of that baseline prerequisite for potential conflicts. Enduring rivalries, this comes from international relations, and this basically means that countries with a history of conflict in the past are more likely to have conflict again in the future. It kind of speaks to the way that their relationship is going. And so we'll use these 2 clues, and I'll use these 2 icons, these fishing vessels sharing space, and these silly little angry guys represent the 2 clues that we're going to try to tap into to look and assess the risk of conflict. So what can spatial competition and enduring rivalries tell us about the risk landscape of international conflict in particular, and specifically which regions and which countries or where and who might be at the highest risk? So I study this tiny thing, Pacific Ocean, and the reason I do is because, well, I'll say first, I'm looking at longline fleets in particular. There are a couple really major types of fishing styles and gears here. Sort of a cartoon of what a longline looks like. A boat goes out, sets a long line with a bunch of hooks. These can be 150 kilometers long, so they're massive operations, and they come back when fish are caught on there. And it attracts a lot of different countries worldwide because there's a lot of very economically valuable fisheries. About 60% of the world's tuna comes from this area in this picture too. And tuna are really highly mobile species with massive geographic ranges. They're highly transboundary. So as a result, there are 2 regional fishery management organizations in the area, these 2 big blobs. But we also have a lot of sub-regional, national, and all sorts of geographic scales of management in this area to make sure that we're sustainably harvesting these fish. I like this figure because it highlights how busy it is. Each of these different blobs are associated with only the major fishing countries in this region. And so you can see the footprint of the fishing pressure in this area. And you can also see these bubbles here are what are called exclusive economic zones. These are countries' national waters. There are dozens of small island developing states and Pacific Island countries and territories here that are involved in the resource management of the tuna in this region. So very complicated from a jurisdictional standpoint and also really busy. So there's 3 main components for the methods for this project. First, we'll look at spatial competition with fishing vessel tracking data. Then we'll look at enduring rivalries with historical conflict data. And each of these on their own can tell us something about the risk of conflicts. But if you put them together, maybe we can get a bit of a different perspective. And that's what we do. So we find those countries that both share space and have a history of conflict, calling those high-risk regions and actors. And I like to think about this with like a bad roommates analogy, where if you share space with someone and you guys are on good terms, it's fine, maybe. But maybe if you have a history of getting into arguments in the past, that means there's an elevated risk of conflict in the future. So that's kind of the logic that we'll use today to think about assessing risk. So for assessing spatial competition, we use Global Fishing Watch, which is a partnership between Oceana and SkyTruth, partnered with Google too, which basically gives us GPS trackers for fishing vessels all over the world. And they really did a good job of publicizing it. And this was a lot of proprietary data that wasn't aggregated. So this is a cool way where we can really look at those fishing footprints. I got about 5 years of data where the data is the most available. And I assess it at a 1x1 latitude by longitude degree cell. So these little pixels here can be thought of as the spatial resolution that all the analysis takes place in. And that lets us do a couple things. We can look at which countries are actually interacting spatially, but then we can also look over the whole Pacific Ocean and try to look at where there's more diverse international usage to try to clue us in to spatial competition. So as sort of an intermediate explanatory step, to make our spatial overlap network, we would first plot, we would first plot 2 countries' waters or spatial distributions of fishing. I chose China and Taiwan because they're some of the largest distant water fishing fleets in the world. And so we have China in red, Taiwan in green, and then where they overlap is in blue. And this translates really well to a network approach, which was the main crux of this analysis. And so we can have, in a network, we have nodes or the components that are connected by edges or the links. And the nodes are countries, and we can weight or assign a value to the edges based on the area of overlap. And that gives us a representation of spatial overlap between those 2, just a pair. But we can do that iteratively over all pairs of countries and basically build out a big spatial overlap network. The second part, to look at international community diversity on a spatial perspective, we borrow from community ecology and basically adapt a Shannon's diversity index, where instead of the number of species in a given cell, we look at the number of different countries for richness. And then rather than abundance of species there, we take the number of fishing hours, which is a common measure of fishing effort or fishing intensity by each vessel. And that can give us, paired together, can give us an idea from a network and a spatial perspective about spatial competition. Now, moving on to the second part where we're looking at enduring rivalries. We saw this graph earlier. This is from a paper by Spikers et al., where they use LexisNexis and they scraped media databases about the instances of fisheries conflicts occurring. And they collected a lot of cool data, like who's involved, what species it was over, what the outcome was, and that intensity scale that I showed earlier, each of them have an assigned intensity scale as well. And this translates really well to a network approach. Very simply, very much like a social network analysis, where again, each of the nodes will be countries, and those edges linking them together can be valued based on the either maybe the frequency of intensity between each pair, or maybe the frequency or intensity of the conflicts between each pair. So you can kind of choose I show the results here based on the intensity, but they're quite similar. So now that we have our spatial overlap network and our historical conflict network, we can then slap them together and get the high risk network. So filter the ones that are in common between both, and then map those spatial distributions that they share on the ocean too. So some results. So longline fishing activities are super international and very diverse. There's about 33 countries that engage in this area, but there's definitely dominant players. Here on this bar chart on your left, we have countries on the x-axis and then the total area that countries are fishing on the y-axis, broken up into regions because there are different ecological and also fisheries differences when you move away from the equator. But we can see that the tropical Pacific is super busy. It's sort of that orange color, and most of the bars are comprised of that orange color. And we see large distant water fishing countries come out. We also see some maybe geographic bias. A lot of Asian countries also are coming out as the largest players here, but they make up about 60 or 70% of the world's fishing fleet anyway. So we're picking up a little bit both of those signals. And looking at the international diversity map, we also see a lot of activity in the Pacific too. So not only is it where countries are spending a lot of time in space fishing, but it's also where there's a lot of crowding. We're going to blow that up a little bit. And so we can say there's high diversity, both in the tropical Pacific, but also in the high seas. Again, here on this map, we didn't explain. Here's US, Asia, Oceania, and South America would be over here. These bubbles are those national waters. So you can see inside and outside, there's a slight spatial pattern where it's higher outside in the high seas, where it's not necessarily regulated. And this may be because there's DWF is distant water fishing fleets. Offshore is very similar. They just go very far, stay out at sea for 5, 6, 7 months at a time. This is a figure from the Regional Fishery Management Organization in the area, where they're showing the proportion of fishing effort that is distant water in green, foreign offshore in red, and then in blue, that's where domestic countries are having their fishing activities. And we can see there's some correlations qualitatively just by looking on where we can see high international presence, which makes sense. And then looking inside national waters now, we can see the effects of regional fishery management in the area and international access agreements. This map here with the highlighted waters, the blue and the yellow, both indicate 2 different types of management schemes, where many of these, as I mentioned, are small island developing states. They're smaller countries and territories, and they don't necessarily have the economic capacity to be fishing themselves, but they have rich waters and other countries want to be in there. And so these small countries, these countries that are highlighted, can sell vessel days or fishing effort and licenses to other countries so that they're able to get some sort of economic revenue from their fisheries. And so in these countries that are engaged in these activities, you can see that there's sort of moderate amounts of fishing activity in this area. And as sort of a proof here, this is French Polynesia, and French Polynesia barely has any international activity happening in that area. Any activity that's happening in the area is licensed out by France itself, basically. And so using this perspective, we can see sort of the spatial results of these access arrangements in this region. So who are the high risk actors? Who are the bad roommates? These are the ones who both overlap and have a history of conflict. I don't have time today to show the spatial overlap network or the conflict network, but when you slap them together, this is what you get. And so again, this network has nodes, which are countries connected by edges, which we weighted these edges by what's called a risk score, where we basically multiplied the amount of shared fishing space by the average conflict intensity between those 2 actors. And it's pretty clear that there are different modules or communities that come out of this. All of these heavy red lines in the middle indicate higher risk scores. And we pulled out those dyads or those pairs of countries on the table on the left also. Many of these high risk country dyads are large fishing countries that have just massive geographic distributions for their fishing, but they also have relatively more intense conflicts that result in economic sanctions, military involvement, even physical violence. These are the ones that we often see in media headlines because they're becoming a problem for sure. And then what we can see here in this blue sort of grouping, these groupings, by the way, came out just from a standard network modularity perspective. They calculated it based on how grouped these are together. And you can see that this blue one down here is primarily Pacific Island countries and territories. They share space because they're very geographically close together. And they have conflict with each other, but most of their conflicts are considered level 1 conflicts, which is essentially failing to reach an agreement, which is kind of nice, I think. Like they're trying to do something and maybe it indicates more consensus building. So completely different interactions that come out here. Japan kind of does all the things, which is why it's central node right there. It causes problems and also tries to make friends. And if we map out where those countries are sharing space, very similar spatial distributions. We see the high seas and the tropical regions are coming out as higher, whereas the orange yellowy is a bit higher. Interestingly, we see the highest amount in this little high seas pocket, which is not technically in anybody's waters, but right in between everybody's waters. So it's kind of a sneaky place that people can go and fish, although it is slightly regulated by the regional management. And so we can conclude that maybe competition is more organized where there are established access agreements and when there are interactions between countries, maybe there's already rules and governance in place to help mediate those. And so we can take away that spatial and historical data of that big laundry list of clues. We picked those two out. Maybe it can help us provide insight into these conflict risks that are seemingly occurring primarily in the tropics and in the high seas. And this used to say future work, but I published it. So future opportunities are abound, primarily making this more quantitatively robust, collecting more data, conducting temporal analysis, getting to the specific needs of this area, which would be particular gear interactions. And I always like to say that it's really cool that we can collect all this data, it gives us all this big breadth on this perspective, but we lose a lot of depth, especially in this topic. Qualitative insights and case studies could be really good for complementing this type of perspective. And maybe this type of logic could be useful for other people's systems as well, either looking at the likelihood of conflict and cooperation between stakeholders, especially if there's diverse stakeholder interest with spatial patterns. Maybe applying community ecology lenses here could provide interesting insights too. Okay, so that's what I worked on in my PhD. And now we're going to kind of switch it up a bit to what I'm working on here at ESIIL. And it's still going to be looking at the Pacific, specifically at a lot of those countries with large national waters, but small land area that rely on these countries, on their ocean waters for a lot of those ocean benefits. I'm working with my advisors, Stephen Johnson at Cornell, Jacob Urich at EDF, some of my friends at Santa Fe Institute, primarily Harrison Hartle. I'm obviously here at ESIIL, and then our very own Min is helping me with this project as well. So we've seen this, don't need to necessarily go over this again, but I just want to highlight that we're going to focus on the protein and the micronutrients aspects of this really complicated fisheries system. And so fisheries provide about 12% of people's protein worldwide, and per capita consumption of seafood is increasing. These different bars, stacked bar charts, are regions and continents. That blue line across the top is a worldwide average. Everything is on average increasing. And not every country can fish, obviously, not every country has an ocean next to it. And a part of why this per capita seafood consumption is increasing is because of trade. And so this should just look like a hairball. This is just to show how crazy the seafood supply chain is and how interconnected it is between different regions of the world. To the blue bars are to go with the percentage axis on the left, showing the contribution of fisheries to people's protein intake. Whereas these light blue dots go with this axis on the right, which shows per capita income or intake. What we'll notice is that in the high income countries and the upper middle income countries, the dots are above those bars, meaning that high income countries consume more per capita seafood, but it's less important for them from a whole dietary perspective. And we see the opposite on the low, middle, and the low income countries, where these are more important for these countries' demographics, but they have access to less of it to eat on a yearly basis. And then you throw trade into there, where trade automatically favors these rich countries that can afford to import these sorts of nutrient-rich foods. And on top of that, when we have shocks to the network, let's say COVID came and it affected a central node, which China and other really important processing countries, there are ripple effects all over the world. When things like that happen, richer countries tend to hold on to their imports and slow their exports, meaning that countries that are lower in the socioeconomic status may not be able to actually access these foods, although they're already at some sort of disadvantage. So it could negatively affect those that are already vulnerable, and it could have a lot of different food security and health outcomes as well. This is super true in the Pacific. So this is just kind of zoomed in on those countries that I was talking about earlier. We have Australia there for reference. Culturally, traditionally, these countries and territories rely a lot on aquatic foods. It's very much part of their lifestyle, but they're really import dependent. If you look at the geographic distributions of them, obviously they can only do so much farming and be so self-sufficient. And so there's a lot of imports, but primarily of really sugary drinks, calorically heavy foods, processed foods, etc. This region of the world actually has some of the highest rates of obesity, heart disease, and other non-communicable diseases as well. So there's certainly a link. And people's diets are certainly influenced by the food system structures that we've created, and trade is a huge part of it. And so this is the system that I'm going to continue to look at. These are the selection of Pacific Island countries. Unfortunately, the territory data is very hard to get. So I'm going to look at countries first and then try to get into territories, which I think just speaks more to the political economy and sort of the power differences that are affecting this area. There's no data availability. If there's no data, it's hard to take action on those things. So my overarching research questions, I will present really quickly and then kind of just show some fun initial graphs as well. So what do these international networks of fisheries derived nutrients look like? We can have trade networks, nutrient networks, and then try to figure out what the health outcomes could be of that. And then going back, why are they like that? We know trade agreements could facilitate these things. Oceanographic and climate conditions are huge in this area. When there are strong El Niños, tuna move into high seas out of countries' waters, and there's no governance set in place to maintain those fishing rights in that area. Foreign fishing access, as I mentioned in the previous section, how are countries subsidizing or funding their fleets to expand over the world's oceans? And transshipment is becoming a big issue. Countries' vessels can stay at sea for up to a year at a time now because another boat will come to them, get their catch, and then take that to land, and then this other boat will just continue fishing. And so this has really big implications for the amount that countries can fish, and then obviously just changes the whole dynamic of the supply chain as well. And then lastly, what are the impacts of these? These topics tie directly to at least 3 sustainable development goals about zero hunger, health and well-being, and then the sustainability of life below water, they call it, or fisheries and ocean conservation sustainability goals. And so trying to tie all of these together in a way to inform these issues. This was like really hard to do even just like 5 years ago because seafood traceability is a massive issue. It's really hard to know where the fish on your plate actually came from, who caught it, which boat, where did they take it to, because it's not necessarily the same country that caught it and is processing it. And then once it goes into the supply chain, it's kind of a mystery a little bit. So in recent years, especially people at University of Washington, Jessica Gebhardt, have been developing a new database called Aquatic Resource Trade and Species, where they've gone in used some fun machine learning stuff and collected a bunch of different data, primarily from FAO and UN reports, to clarify this, basically. And so this data is structured in a way where you can figure out what country sourced it, which waters did it come from, what country did it then go to next, and then who is the consuming country as well. It's at the species level and at a really long time scale, which is great for looking at temporal shocks and whatnot. And so I rely on that data, but then also compare it, or combine it rather, with this nutrient composition database, which has several different important micronutrients, protein, etc., that you can merge really nicely. So rather than having a trade network of a volume of species or whatnot, you can just combine the two and get nutrient networks globally for how these are flowing around the world. And this lets us look into, for the Pacific in particular, what roles are countries playing in terms of source, exporter, consumer, what is the network layout over time, and then maybe who is a net importer, exporter, and specifically our hypothesis, unfortunately, for the Pacific Islands would be that they're at a net loss all the time of these nutrients. And so there's some real initial figures here. These are both showing you about country roles. On the left, you have source, exporter, and consumer. And these are just the ISO codes, so they're all abbreviated, of different countries. But we can already kind of initially see in the source, we have Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Vanuatu, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Federated States of Micronesia, Solomon Islands. Those are all Pacific Island countries. So they are generally the sources. They're less often the exporters, and they are consuming a lot, but you also see a lot of more North American and European countries. So at first glance, there's a bit of a qualitative socioeconomic difference here. This Sankey diagram right here, I kind of put in because it's I worked on it a lot and it looks fun. Looks like some candy. But basically you also have the same roles: source, exporter, consumer, and these are divided into either Pacific Island countries or non-Pacific Island countries, so more of a binary approach here. And at first glance, in the source column, you can see this is proportional basically, and I should mention each of these colors are different nutrients that are flowing. In the proportional column of source, you can see that picks are again a huge source role, whereas non-picks are a lot smaller. And then they flow through non-picks, picks, and domestic, which we'll talk about in a second, for the exporter, and eventually ending up in the consumer countries. The picks make up about half of the consumer countries actually, which is better than I would anticipate. But if you look at how much of that is flowing domestically, meaning that picks catch it and then picks consume it, it never leaves those countries. So they're being self-sufficient to a certain amount. About half of what Pacific Island countries are able to consume is because they've caught it themselves, not because they're receiving it from other countries. Only this small proportion would be things that are flowing in, and most of those nutrients are flowing out. Okay, this shouldn't tell you anything really. It just kind of looks cool, I think.
Yeah.
So this is a network. Rather than picks or non-picks, we've broken up the nodes into actual countries. They're colored by continent, so you can kind of see the source of them. All the Pacific Island countries are that red color in Oceania. And it's kind of flicking through annual trade networks. This is protein, I believe. So this is how protein is flowing over that time period. Again, this is super uninformative, but one thing that you'll notice is that the network changes over time. So the topology changes over time, and you can gather information about things like network density, the richness, the modularity, which is the communities and the groupings that are occurring. And you can pull out different time series too. So this is just to show that with this representation, we can also get these network summary statistics essentially that will be used in future modeling against some of the socio-demographic, trade, and other sorts of factors too. And hopefully we can do some sort of difference to difference or some sort of causal inference type things to look at where these timelines change. Okay, this should be a little more digestible. So up at the top, this is the same network, just kind of broken up into 5 specific years. In 2005, I've pointed out Papua New Guinea. And you'll notice relative to 2003, 2004, it kind of comes online a little bit. and has a lot more exports to those yellow nodes, which are all European countries. One reason, potential reason for that could be that in 2005, they signed an agreement with the EU to start having more export-driven economic growth. And so these are the types of shocks, these are the types of agreements that we're going to try to investigate a little bit to tease out if this is why the network is as it is. You can see from 2005 onward, there's a lot more activity. 2008, there's less activity because of the financial crisis. And that is another shock that we think really affected this area as countries who were richer started to keep a lot of their resources with less exports. So next steps, I'm going to dive more into network modeling in particular. There's this thing called percolation modeling, which is basically like, does one node facilitate or inhibit flows between other nodes? Interestingly, this has been used in wildfire research, I found, to look at how a wildfire might spread through a forest or not. We'll use it to look at how countries might facilitate or inhibit spread of nutrients. Exponential random graph models are basically a way to look at link prediction to predict who might be trading with who. And then other than that, I need to collect a bunch of data, looking at all of those factors that I've been talking about for a while. And really the effort is to try to merge environmental, ecological with trade outcomes, nutrition outcomes, et cetera, and try to get sort of a bit of a holistic approach from a large spatial scale to make some inferences about how this is in the end affecting how we want equitable sustainable development to end up occurring. And again, this is just pretty slow palate cleanser before we all leave. And that's it.
Keiko, are there questions?
Oh, go ahead, Ty. No, you go ahead. Mine's a complete aside, so you should go first.
All right. Man, I love networks. That was super cool.
Yeah.
One of the things that's cool about networks is that you can see sort of the 6 degrees of separation sort of things, like which background players are helping those big conflicting things.
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell us about just sort of that next level? I mean, like that one in particular of like countries conflicting in the red triangle. Like,
Yeah.
how much is that outer level contributing to that inner level of conflict?
That's a good question. And that's something that people have thought about in like international relations a bit, but haven't really applied from what I know into like a network translation there. But there are these things called hypergraphs or higher order networks that basically, rather than connecting 2 nodes together, they can connect many nodes together. And that would kind of help get to that a little bit, like, because there are these really complicated geopolitical like allies and relationships that are not captured here. And so maybe there's less conflict between a couple of different countries because they have some sort of trade agreement going on and they're less likely to want to instigate something of that sort. So I think it'd be a really cool direction to go and would just maybe require different data and just constructing the network in a slightly different way. You could also do multi-layer networks too, where you can maybe think about one layer is who's actually instigating the conflict and then who's like receiving the conflict. And there's probably some sort of interactions in that area too. Yeah, especially because the Pacific is so complicated right now. Another thing that we were thinking about doing is who has military bases in which countries too. Australia is maybe not likely to start a fight with somebody that they're a military ally with. Similarly, China and the US are the other big players there as well. So I think that could be really cool from a network.
Let me ask a follow-up about the topology question. So in food webs anyway, I'm thinking about that last part when you're talking about the calories of the protein going up.
Yeah.
In food web stuff, I've seen people think about webs versus sort of the verticality of the network in terms of like how efficiently is the network like moving food upward.
Right.
And it seems like here there's a question about like how much is it a web where there's sort of like inefficiency consuming itself and how much is there sort of like linear efficiency where it's pretty good at moving things up to different places of the network. Do you know anything about the topologies of just how efficiently they move in that percolation stuff you're talking about?
Yeah, that could actually be really cool. I mean, I would imagine, so this little guy here is an example of a multi-layer network. Maybe you could separate that out by the different roles and see, yeah, who's actually getting that consumption. I'd imagine it would maybe look more like a pyramid than we would want it to, as it's going to those large consuming countries. But that could be a cool way to like maybe make policy or like commentary, like
Even how sharp the pyramid is, like
Yeah.
how extractive is the thing versus how is it being fed back into the community.
yeah, right. And you ideally want that pyramid to, yeah, kind of widen at the top, so it's distributed better.
Super red.
I just have an aside. So you were talking about tracking fish, tracking species. I know I just saw something recently, so I'm just curious what you know about like. This is on terrestrial side, but like people were really freaked out by mad cow, and there was a lot of effort to try to start tracking beef products and meat products, just for tracking diseases when something comes up. How much is that translated into the fishing market, and how effective is it?
Yeah, so people tried to do that. I can't remember the term right now. I think people are still trying to do it, but they're trying to basically give a barcode to each individual fish,
Yeah.
right? So like if you have 20 different fish that get caught in a net and then that goes to land and then that gets distributed into 5 different shipments in different places, can you track that back to that place? The answer is no.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to do that. But people have thought about that a lot, like really getting very granular with it. It requires a lot of technology and buy-in from the fishing industry, I think, to be able to have these other sorts of channels and like data collection services and stuff. People are doing it on smaller scales, but at the scale that I'm looking at things, it, yeah,
Large international market, or
yeah, it just kind of disappears into stuff. That's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, Kyle.
Or what you were talking about with tide, where you have countries sort of avoiding conflicts because they're maybe allies or there's a trade agreement there. I think, is there any evidence, or like the more interesting question is that like is when countries are around each other more, or sort of where you're saying there's conflict or there's potential conflict there? Is there evidence of that actually being like the cause of a trade agreement or something like that? I think that'd be
Yeah.
a causal pathway to actually more cooperation rather than conflict.
Yeah. That's a good question. That would be cool. I know that like conflict is more likely the closer you are to someone. That's why like conflict over rivers or borders or things like that is often happening. Yeah, I don't know. I would imagine that if there's like sub-regional trade, that would be good to do. Something in the Pacific that they're trying to do is encourage more sub-regional trade, because there's a lot of just imports and exports all over the world where they're not necessarily, so people say they're not like supporting each other in that sort of sense. One issue with that is that if you're geographically close and your economies are similar, you're producing a lot of the same things. And so maybe there's not necessarily a reason for you to be trading so much. You kind of want to diversify. Yeah.
Yeah, because so like with your first PhD project, it's kind of like assumed that the more these countries are around together fishing, it's just gonna be conflict, and maybe that's just how fisheries work, but so
Yeah.
there's not really evidence that the more people around each other, maybe they try to cooperate more.
No, yeah, it's a huge assumption. And that's actually, so when I started this project, I only had the spatial competition part of things. And I was like, well, this is interesting, but it's not speaking to conflict at all, which is where the enduring rivalries part of it came into each other. All of the enduring rivals that we looked at also were conflicting over tuna as well. So we tried to like narrow down the actual topic that they were conflicting over, but it's definitely an assumption. And this is like, I would never use this to try to predict conflict. This is more just like a relative assessment of where there maybe needs to be some more attention. But you're right. I mean, a lot of these countries are pretty friendly with each other, which is why the intensity scale comes in a little bit for some added context. But sharing space doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna fight poacher things.
Right, this is like less than a half baked thought, but do you think there could be any like added information that it could be useful from, like, for predicting where conflicts might be? Looking at like migration patterns of certain like highly fished species. And then looking at the countries or the fishing entities that fish those species, and then kind of looking at where those things might kind of converge to be able to predict where conflict might be.
Yes, totally. And so project I was kind of working on was like using random forest models to kind of predict in the future where there might be more fishing effort based on primary productivity, sea surface temperature, all that stuff. And that's sort of like a convergence. We were calling it like resource compression. Like if all this big tuna comes into this area, maybe they're more likely to conflict. I also have some collaborators at WWF that just launched this really cool website, Our Ocean Futures, I think it's called, where they do exactly that. They take like a climate perspective, they project out to various RCPs and scenarios, and you can click on what they identify as case studies. And the baseline like criteria for picking that is, are there going to be more transboundary species either moving from one national water to another national waters in the high seas, or vice versa. And a lot of these fish stocks are moving forward, right, to keep up with their thermal niches. So that's definitely something to think about. These ones also happen to be the more economically valuable ones that are moving very quickly too. So yeah, I think that's a good like first step. And then obviously there's like a ton of nuance there too, because maybe there are like the US and Canada is pretty decent at already making like preemptive agreements for like fish moving up into Canada, but a lot of countries don't. So that could be an added risk factor on top of that. Yeah, Cassie.
Good job. I was thinking, and this is maybe more like a different approach, or like, I want to know what you think of it, is like, from like, and this, I guess the goal here is maybe to understand these networks, but like, perhaps there's like a game theoretical approach where if you are one of the, I guess, agents in the model, like you want to, are you going to get along with your neighbor or not? And I guess you could do it, I don't know if this is maybe ethical, but you could maximize the nutrients of your country by who you decide to agree or disagree with. I don't know. I think that would be an interesting approach though, is like to think about it as like a game theory model and, you know, the relationships and like, you know, maybe if a country is like taking all of your nutrients, maybe you could just like, you know, have more conflict with them to disincent to not, so they are not incentivized to do that. I don't know. I think that'd be interesting. It's like thinking about it from that sense.
Yeah, totally. Actually, the grant I was on, they just hired a game theoretic postdoc to look at this sort of stuff from an economic, but also there are several international relations people in this group too. And so thinking about power differences.
Yeah.
If there's one really powerful country and one less powerful country, there's more likely to be a conflict because the outcome is more certain. If they're more evenly like matched, there's not going to be. One actually very recent preliminary result we just talked about like last week was if your waters are declining, if your stocks are declining and you know somebody else's is not, you're gonna go start either trying to just outright take their fish and conflict with them, or you might be more likely to be like, hey, let's have a little agreement here kind of thing. And yeah, I think that would be super cool.
And let's let them run. Oh, go ahead. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, and I have two initial thoughts and comments. So the first one is that the fishes provide the micronutrients to consumers in importing countries, but they can also provide contaminants such as the microplastics or the heavy metals like that. Yeah, I think we can think more about these issues, contaminants issues. And second one is about the related to all others comments and together, and the like the conflicts between the small fisheries from indigenous people and Pacific Islands and the international fleets, and how it affects the indigenous people's the nutrient level like that. And also in this topic, potential topic, you can also adopt game theory like that, like as you mentioned. And this ongoing project provide big picture, but you can focus on the more the community level or the people level, and then it has some great potential to write external funding proposals.
That was important.
And-
Yeah, totally. Those are great points. Especially in Africa, there's a big infringement of distant water fishing fleets, industrial ones, into the nearshore exclusion zones, which are supposed to be only for small scale fleets. And it's really negatively affecting those communities. Unfortunately, those countries' governments in Africa get revenue from allowing those big industrial fleets in there. So there's these interesting conflicts of interests. But yeah, getting to the community level would be super cool.
Yeah, actually, that feeds into my question really well. I like that the economic bit. Like I was thinking about that. I forget the name of the chart, but the bar thing where nutrients are going from producers to exporters to consumers. Like layering on the economic onto something like that, and you can kind of, or maybe you can start getting an idea of like how much are you getting for your nutrients that you're selling. Basically, if you just think about this, like it's a trade, right? So you're getting money for every nutrient you're selling. Are you getting a good return on your investment or good on your sale, right? Like I imagine a lot of the producers are getting the lowest dollar, the exporters are getting the higher dollar because they're processing probably and doing more of that like transformation of the, and so like that tends to give you a better return on your investment. So I wonder like the difference between pure producers versus these countries that are probably doing some processing and exporting, and like how much value are they getting for their nutrients would be also interesting to look at.
Yeah, like grams of protein per dollar.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, it's a cool idea.
Thank you, Keiko. That was awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
And Bailey and Catherine Siegel say, great presentation, really good work.